you for coming back. We are going to have the panel discussion section. It will be facilitated by Professor Ng. She will give out the question and will introduce the panel member. Each member will have about 3 minutes to give their views on the question and may also respond to other panel members' views. And after the presentation, the panel will be open up for questions. Let me now hand over the stage to Professor Ng.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Rita. Okay, so we have a question for the panel, which is about the educative approach to minimizing plagiarism in relationship to your own institute, in practice, or in general. We have given them this question beforehand, so we're not giving them a test. Okay, so it will be, the order will be one by one, so let me introduce them first. Firstly is Dr. Cecilia Chan, and she's from Hong Kong U, and she's the head of Professional Development Center for Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. The second one, Professor Paul Lam, he's from Chinese University, and he is with Center for Learning Enhancement and Research. We usually call it called CLEAR, so that's why sometimes I don't know what is the long term. Okay, the third one is Professor Diane Pagurati, and he's from City U. He is the department head of English. And then next to her is Dr. Eva Chan, and she is the director from Center for Holistic Teaching and Learning, Baptist University. And the last person you have already met is Professor Marcia Devlin. Okay, and she will make her answer as well as make any conclusion, etc. But it is really up to her if she would like to make a conclusion after the panel have spoken or after the floor have asked questions. Okay, so may I have Dr. Chen first? Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia. Hi, how are you doing? Thanks for your invite to come into Lingnan again.
Thank you.
In relation to your question, I think it's probably like most university, right, around the world and among here as well. We have policy, right, on plagiarism, and it's a serious offense if the student did not abide to it. Now, do we do training like this? Now, this is something I have in my mind while I was in the workshop, because obviously we all learned something today. And I know our library also run a lot of plagiarism workshop, right? But it's not compulsory, right? And I think some of the librarians would probably agree with me. And so people can, students can come whenever they want to, right? Or they don't want to. Now, of course, we don't know how much do they understand the term or the definition of plagiarism, okay? And I think that's one of the main things. Now, we have guidebooks, right? In fact, I brought back this page. It's in a book before. It's like, what is plagiarism? Which have examples and, are we paraphrasing each other? Is paraphrasing allowed? What exactly is the policy? And of course, what is the punishment? The top punishment is like, sent to the disciplinary action committee, go through with the senate and then professors and students who are sitting, obviously that occur when it's very, very serious, but not, all the time. A lot of time is warnings, in terms of the punishment. But I do have this, question in my own mind, right? Because being the head of professional development for the university, one of the things that we often get to ask, right, are not just, paper to paper. I think people kind of know. Intentional, unintentional, yes, right? That's one thing. How much unintentional they're trying to do, because after they paraphrasing it, they go, yeah, I think the original sounds better, right? It is more simpler, sounds better. Maybe I kind of paraphrase it, right? So, so that it is very gray, right? That line is very gray in terms of intentional and unintentional. But what I do have in mind is that I have a professor asking me, if I want my student to sit in a classroom like this, okay, and do an exam, okay, and basically there and then, how do you ensure they don't plagiarize from each other or copy from each other? Okay, so that's one thing. But then another teacher, basically, and computer science professor, he goes, what if we give them a laptop and ask them to code, program coding? How do we ensure that they don't copy from each other? Given that we have all these technology these days, they can Skype each other. So you could be in that side of the room, like, you obviously skip 2 seats between them. But you could be in that side of the room, and then that guy is your friend, and you can pass code to each other. How do you deal with that, right? So that's a new form of plagiarism, isn't it, in a way that I don't have the answer. And of course, at the time, they were kind of pushing me, if you say yes, then we can do it, right? And, and I said, Dad, you really need to talk to your department, right? In terms of, are you allowed to do that kind of thing? And another thing that comes to my mind is that plagiarism and copyright, and ethical, all right, are all very, related to each other. And all of these have gray line on it. Like, we are not totally sure, even as academics, right? We do research, right? And we understand we cannot copy, but what about you build on something? How much can you build on something without totally overlapping as well? I think those are kind of the question I have. And unfortunately, I don't have all the answers either, but these are some of the things we are doing. So we have library who is doing a great job, but how do we ensure that all our students know, about plagiarism? And then, because one of the things when I wrote here, I wrote punishment. We talk about punishment. You can't punish a student if you haven't given them warning or training, right? If they're not really sure. So if all our workshops are not compulsory, and yet you haven't really given them proper training, and yet you punish them, is that ethical? And I will finish at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so next, Paul.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for Eugenia for giving me a chance to say something today. I would say Chinese U is also very much like Hong Kong U. We have all sorts of warnings, threatening in our policies. We usually like to summarize our standpoint called zero tolerance policy. We call it zero tolerance. Very, very threatening, right? Okay. What term do you have then? Oh, okay. So the same term actually. I thought it's CUHK only. Okay, fine. So not only threaten the student, it actually threaten the teachers a lot too. Okay, because with the technology now, the students have to submit all the assignment to something an engine, and then the teacher has to read all the reports whether students have gone to an alarming score. The higher score means more copying is suspected, and then teachers are also very nervous. Okay, if I spotted a warning, what should I do? Okay, so I think what I got from the talk today, I think first of all, I really appreciate the gray. We take a very detailed look into the gray area. Which my policy here at CUHK actually tend to avoid discussion of the gray area. So zero tolerance. In the policy it says if a teacher spot any plagiarism case, well, 100%, any case, the teacher should report it to the faculty, right? Not to the department immediately. Okay, so no gray area in the policy, but I appreciate today we look at the gray area and actually, and also the unintentional mistakes, and which we tend to pretend we don't have them in the policy. Yes. Second, the second point I got from the workshop today is that since perhaps my background is to support teachers. Today I heard many, it's true, students need a lot of support workshops because of the gray area. But my idea, perhaps after listening to the work today, is that actually our teachers also need something like that. Okay, maybe compulsory workshop, perhaps not, but because of the zero tolerance and the term, when you spot any plagiarism case, you have to report. I think many teachers do not know what to do. Actually, they feel they want to sympathize. Our students it's the gray area. It's a minor mistake, small extent, or even unintentional. So if the teacher gives the students a second chance, it is actually not. It seems to be against the rule. The teacher has to do it. Shut the door. Okay, don't tell anybody. I give you a second chance. But I think we should perhaps start to think about whether we have a more official window for teachers to handle this gray area. Okay, thank you.
Right. Well, I'd like to make my comments more general rather than specifically about City U. Marcia has given us some very important and sensible and practical points. And I'd like to pick up on just two of the things that she said that I think are worth particular attention. First, one of the points was about how writing is one of the things that students need to know how to be able to do, and I think that's hugely important. Education involves not just educating students about our expectations with regard to what they won't do. It also means enabling them to do what's expected, and it's simply not possible to avoid plagiarism and turn in a polished, high-quality piece of academic writing if you don't know how to produce that academic writing yourself. So this is something which is especially critical for us in Hong Kong, where virtually all of our learners are second language users of English, and virtually all of our institutions, with one notable exception, are English medium. It's really important that we understand what skill set students come into university with when it comes to academic writing. But it's not only a problem for second language writers. Bourdieu notably said that academic discourse is nobody's mother tongue. So learning how to write an academic text is something that everybody has to learn when they get to university. How do we see to it that they have those skills that are essential for avoiding plagiarism? Well, I think most of our universities have writing centers and probably have one or two academic writing courses, which all or most students have to take. And that's absolutely an essential condition, but not a sufficient condition. It's not enough to give students a course or two and think that they will be able to be polished academic writers thereafter. I'm still learning how to write well in my discipline, and every day I learn something new about it. So learning how to write good texts that satisfy the demands of academia generally and of the specific discipline, and satisfy the demands of the specific kind of writing task which has been assigned, and satisfy the particular instructor who may have different views from the one next door. That's always a work in progress. That means that writing competently is something that has to happen not just in our English language centers, but in every course that every student takes across the university. And a lot of my colleagues from other disciplines say, but I'm not a writing teacher, and I would dispute that. Right? I think we all know a lot about what constitutes good writing in our disciplines, and it's simply not possible to separate disciplinary knowledge from the way we communicate it. So I think we all have to take a responsibility for teaching our students what good writing is and helping them achieve it. And the other point I'd like to touch on briefly is the point about how follow-through is critical. It's not enough to threaten we're not good parents, we're not good teachers, if we don't then check whether our children or our students have done what we've asked and give them feedback. It's not only part of the job, it's dangerous if we don't. If a student hands in a piece of writing, and very often, certainly there are some students who intentionally set out to plagiarize in a very deliberate way. Very often there are students who aren't certain whether they've crossed the line. And from our perspective, we notice some things, other things perhaps we don't notice. When a student, from the student perspective, if a piece of writing gets handed in and comes back without any comments saying, you shouldn't have done it that way, the message isn't, maybe my teacher didn't notice. The message is, I must have done it okay. So if we don't give feedback on the aspects of working with sources that don't work, we are in fact being perceived as giving feedback. Yes, you're doing it right. So that's why it's hugely important that we do that follow through. How do we do that? How do we know how our students are using sources? Well, most of the time we don't. Even though we submit work to Turnitin is a hugely imperfect tool. It gives false positives and it gives false negatives. So most of the time, we don't really see how our students are using the sources they've read unless we structure assessment tasks in such a way that that really will be exposed to us. So I guess that's the other point which Marcia made, but I think it's just so important to pull out that we have to do this follow through, and part of that means structuring assessment so that we are enabled to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall I? Hello. Good. Is it? Oh, not quite afternoon. Still good morning. I'm Eva from the Center for Holistic Teaching and Learning. I have to read the name out in full because it's a mouthful, right? Center for. They always call us CHTL. That's why they don't call us. So it's actually a teaching and learning center, but we actually get involved in quite a lot of things, particularly because it's actually supporting teaching and learning. Now, this is an unusual panel for me because I've been in panels in the past couple of weeks. They're all male. I'm the only one, only female. So this is very unusual that we have an all-male panel, bar one, all-female panel, bar one. So this is much more exciting. So sorry about this. Actually, I was actually listening, and I thought, oh God, what am I going to say that I won't plagiarize now? But I think I would plagiarize in the sense that all of us have policies, guidelines that we actually give to our students, give to our teachers. You know, you have to remind the teachers we do have policies and guidelines, and it's your responsibility to tell the students. Now, in our university, I think we take the first year very seriously. When they come in, when they actually first come into the university, we actually ask them to do an online tutorial. So they actually, all first years, or all new students, whether they're first year at undergraduate, sub-degree, or now we have the senior year entry, or then they do postgraduate studies, whether it's a top postgraduate or PhD, they have to do this online tutorial, and they have to pass, and they have to make a declaration. Now they're we're actually thinking about making use of the online environment to show them case studies, and then they will actually have to answer questions, and the questions are deliberately very vague, and then they will do that. So if they get 80%, they pass, they make a declaration. So from that perspective, the university have done our job, got data to show that everybody has done this now, they're taught now in first year. And of course, then plagiarism happens in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, even at postgraduates levels. But then that's when the library and the other courses come in, put up resources and have make up workshops and things. But again, that comes into the concept now. They are not compulsory. Is it just in time when your deadline is due tomorrow? It's 12 o'clock at night. The library is so far away, even with the online resources. Cut and paste is the fastest. So somehow we actually feel that this kind of emphasis has to be a constant thing. It has to be a concerted and constant. And we are still struggling at that. I have to say we're still struggling. Apart from the online tutorial, recently we've introduced using more technology to actually wake up, because again, the guidelines are things so plain, nobody reads them apart from me, I suppose. Or some people you have to read it because something happens. So we actually have made use of augmented reality, and they go around the trail with their first year. And we actually work with some of the year one teachers so that they are teaching year one English, in the language center. So after going through the trail, when they go to classes, they reinforce this idea. Now, we still need to see the data coming back, whether that is actually helpful. But intuitively, one would think that if you, at least in the first year, and they come in, you tell them this is important, they do the online tutorial, they do the trail to go through some of the things almost like in real life, and then they get reinforced in the classroom. At least the plan seems to have a plan working, so we have to see the data. But one of the thing about online, that's why we like it so much, is it does provide us with some data that is not available to us before. Like in this particular academic year, when the first group of year one student comes in, we have our own student, the local, the mainland, and then the non-local students. And when we analyze their response along the trail, how they actually pick the different options, we found that there are similarities on some areas, like do you need to cite something or not cite something? We were trying to say something which seems so simple. In your case, it's a rabbit is a mammal. In our case, is the world for all, right? It's the world for all from Dr. Sun Yat-sen. So our local student and the mainland student seems to have a coherence in their answering about citation, but the non-local students, they have no idea what that is. So somehow that actually gives us the context now becomes more complicated because you have a very diverse student body. So I think that's one of the pathway we want to look at, is collecting more data on the responses to target their help. And it's by no means complete. We found that students actually, apart from assignment, when they do final year project is when they start flogging to the library. So the library is actually very important because it's a remind them that, wow, these things that we have to do. But these sort of driven by assignment thing is also dangerous because they only do it because they're rushed and then they forget about it afterwards. So, just like my colleagues here, we are trying to do our best. We try to coordinate, but there's no one solution that fits all, and I think we just have to keep at it. Mm-hmm.
Any question from the floor, or observations or experience?
Hello?
This is working now. Yeah. So quiet, behaving like your student.
Maybe I pose a question.
Yes,
to the audience.
right.
Have any teacher actually come across any of their students who went through plagiarism? So what kind of punishment, what did you do with them?
Nobody. Nobody have encountered any student who have plagiarized? Okay, at least brave.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do actually, like, for the last 2 semesters that I've just actually started teaching here for 1 year, and then I actually come across students. Well, for some of the students, I could actually tell they were intentionally plagiarizing. So for those students, it's quite easy. I can just delete them, or not really delete them, but it's like just give them a certain punishment or whatever. But it's like, again, we were just now having discussions about some of the students. They might be. I could sense that they might. Well, sometimes I had a conversation with them. It's like, do you find this as something wrong, or it's like, are you actually aware of what you are doing? It's actually a serious issues about plagiarism and so forth. But a lot of them, for example, from year one, they are indeed not being delivered in a proper message at the beginning that I could actually found off. So, and this is one thing that I am actually really sorry about, as I'm going to or I would give them a message, but again, it's like 1 or 2 marks deducted, how effective will it be, and so forth. And then, and there are another group of students is like that I would be having like struggling about the same thing as, for example, I ask you to read 3 readings and then do an essay out of it, and then end up I receive his assignment as like he actually read 10 articles. So I suppose I should be very appreciative with his effort, but unfortunately when I'm reading about it, it's like I can see all the different style writing and so forth. So I could actually sense that he actually paid a lot of effort. He paid 3 times more effort than the other students reading 10 articles. But unfortunately, what can I do with it? It's like the grades will be out of the effort, or the grades will be So this is something that I'm always trying to struggle. But again, it's like I personally, I think in terms of teaching, in terms of learning, I should be more encouraging to them. So again, it's more likely in education about the environment that we should actually give them. So I really agree with your slides about sometimes we have to think about it's like in terms of teaching, how could we actually incorporate all this message into the students as well, to actually minimize the plagiarism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Paulina, and you, the gentleman, would you like to speak? Yeah, thank you.
Just I mentioned in this morning, I'm the dissertation supervisor. So that's one of the objectives, to see how to help the student to minimize, the plagiarized writing. That's why, maybe the topic today seems we just look for the, focus on the student, But I totally agree with Professor Leb that we need help. And especially, I'm not the, English teachers, that's why I'm glad that Professor Diane and some of the department English teachers, that how the teachers get help, That is the main problem. Sometimes, especially right now, digitalization, copy and paste is so tempting. Actually, we are in desperate situations sometimes, especially like me, I'm not an English teacher. I'm a subject teacher, a module teacher. So, where I can get the help? Because I'm not the expert to teach them to write English. That is the dilemma.
But I guess this one's on.
This one's better.
Thanks. Right. I'd like to challenge that a little bit. You may not be an English teacher, but you are an expert in what constitutes good writing in your subject area. If you can't teach your students how to write effectively, nobody else can, particularly at the PhD level, where writing, the expectations on the writing that goes into a thesis really are that, it's sort of genuine, authentic academic writing. But I think the difficulty that you identified was about the ease of copy and paste behavior. And to some extent, I think you can make students responsible for helping you see what they've done. Students who are genuinely concerned and confused about what they can and can't do with their sources are usually very eager to say, this is what I did, is it okay? Now, it's very difficult to give that kind of individual attention to a class of 50, but when we're talking about one PhD supervisee, or even, if you have 15 PhD supervisees, they're getting individual attention. So it's actually possible to open up that conversation and enlist their help in understanding what they've done and then responding to it. And there are really significant differences across academic disciplines in terms of what's tolerated and indeed in terms of what's actively encouraged. So actually, you're a whole lot better suited than anybody in the English department or anybody in the English Language Center to tell your students, yeah, this is good, or no, somebody's going to have a problem with that, do it differently.
We have we have tried a different approach at our university. Some of our colleagues from the Language Center on the English section, they actually work with academics to design some assessment. And if the collaboration goes well, then what they do is they will actually help with the English marking, while the colleagues deal with the subject matter. Now, I wouldn't say that it's very prevalent. Everybody's doing it. It's actually a lot. It's something that they're piloting in the Language Center, because they feel that to have subject teacher working together with an English teacher, it will actually highlight the importance of language. Because very often we get 10% to language or 15% to language, and then the student almost they don't pay attention to that. So long as we got the content correct. To me, I totally agree with Diane. What does that mean? Getting the content correct, but nobody understands what you have written. So is that a good essay? So we try some of that. And in terms of actually showing what the student, I totally agree with you. Students are getting very creative in their plagiaristic acts, because we actually every year, or mostly, we actually run some sharing sessions where teachers will actually share their experience, and the poor Language Center teachers have to deal with the bulk of it because they teach everyone, right? Everybody has to go through some course in the Language Center. Even if your English is very good, there are courses that you must go, and there are courses in Chinese that they must take. So they go through the bulk of the plagiarism. And the stories they tell are quite fantastic, because if they actually spend so much time thinking about what to do, how to plagiarize, why can't they spend the time writing a good piece of work? So just as like that colleague said, why did you do that? You read 10 pieces already. Why did you not write a good piece and then to cut and paste? So it's somehow difficult to fathom that.
Yeah.
Maybe I add some more points about teacher support and then about student support. Teacher support is just an idea I just formalized after listening to Marcia. So I have no answer at all. What kind of support can be given to teacher? Maybe later, after talking to what teachers really need, I think my first comment, maybe they need to feel confident. They can handle the gray area cases. Right now, they don't even have the official permit to do so. Right now, they have to report everything. I would say for policies, policies usually avoid gray area. Otherwise, it's very difficult to implement. But anyway, but for teachers and students, they are human. They make errors, and teachers need some. I don't know whether policy can do that. Can give teachers some thing they can handle themselves. Anyway, that needs exploration. Before I can tell what kind of thing can be given to teacher, and it can be different from one university to another. For student support, I heard what Eva said. Actually, that reminded me we had a lot of student support already as well in our university. For example, our library has an online course on copyright, compulsory, totally online. Our Office of Student Affairs, they have workshops for students only, workshop for students about how to avoid plagiarism, and I have taught a number of them before. And I realized that because of that experience, I realized that students really need support. But maybe more than general support that I can give, because I can't answer their questions most often. I talk about general things you should avoid, and then they tell me specific cases, which I don't understand. Is that their discipline? So that's why I think teachers support a teacher of that discipline has to be given some free hand training so that they can do some work to help as well, not only general support from us. By the way, lastly, another thing I have done, apart from the support, the workshop, in our university, we all students go to orientation and they are given at least 5 minutes of warning. Okay, so it's the policy written to them line by line. Okay, the zero tolerance policy. And unluckily, and I'm feeling very guilty. I was the person every time. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I just have a comment, and I think this has been very interesting session, and moreover than just the problem we're talking about today, it highlights there are some issues that are university level issues. So I can have course level intended learning outcomes, a major might have major level learning outcomes. Being able to deal with things honestly, correctly, is a university level phenomenon, and no one is in charge of looking at that, right? And so I have control of what happens in my classes. Someone might have some control over what happens in a department, but there's not someone looking after the whole university. And so I don't envy many of you in the position of trying to train us, right? So the work needs to be done with the professors and the students. That's clearly much more discussion needs to be taking place there. The last thing that I want to do as a professor is for someone to say, I need to go to another training, right? So I came today, and I'm very happy I came today, but if Eugenia said, we must all do this, so we have to check a box, I would come in with a bad attitude. I mean, so I don't know how, you know, at a place like Lingnan, where we're much smaller, there's the potential for much more interaction among professors. At your larger universities, this is virtually impossible. So I'm wondering, you know, I think we know what needs to be done. What can sort of help lots more communication needs to take place among so many different people, none of which has that much time or interest in dealing with it. So how can the university support you to support us better? I mean, is that?
Mark, I just realized you're a bad student. No, we act exactly like our students, don't we, right? One of the things that you, Marcia showed the slide of the comparison field, right, of teachers and learning field, and then students, you know, feel assessment is the most important. So because in a way, like, we are not being punished, right? It's not as important for us, so plagiarism is not in the radar yet. So, you know, we're not really caring about it as much. But if it does come to radar, so for example, you know, 10 years ago we started outcome-based, right? And we got this push from the top down. You know, basically UGC is saying we have to do it, and there's a lot of push, and then eventually we just adapted, accepted, and now we are, you know, changing. Okay, and same thing in terms of plagiarism. It's not there touching us yet. You know, nobody's coming to kick our butts, basically. But one of the things that occurs to me is this, right? And I mentioned it to some of my colleagues there. Is research conduct, right? If you are a researcher, you know, in any of the UGC university applying for, say, GRF, right? You are expected to do a research conduct seminar, at least in my university. Now, that actually only occurred as a policy in the last 3 or 4 years as a compulsory situation. So professors from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, chair professor didn't have to expect to do them, okay? Now, except, I remember last year, and it was around May, the end of the term, a room of 300 people, all professors at different level, right, from deans to chair professor to PVC, turn up to this one-day research seminar conduct. And the reason they turned up was that we have put in a policy: if you have not attended this course, you're not allowed to apply for GRF. Full stop, right? And that was it. So everybody turned up, and so I don't know. Like, I mean, of course, I understand. I mean, if Eugenia comes to me and go, you have to do that training course, then it's like, oh, why, but aren't we like students, But so I'm just wondering, I mean, how important is plagiarism? Or should we just make people be aware, promote the awareness, the understanding, education, as you mentioned, more important than punishing them, But is there any way we can push it enough, drive enough that they realize that importance in the first place? Thanks.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm so glad to hear that Hong Kong U actually has a policy that everybody has to do this or else, because we have been told that Baptist is a very parental university. Our students said that you're like our parents. You make us do things, and I said, yeah, we make. I think the university make academics do things as well. So parents is sort of like is how we care for you. Parents caring. So I think it's exactly what Mark right?
Yeah.
It's just said is. When you said that, I would hate it if you want me to come here and tick the box. But what I found that is somehow you have to tick the box first, and then if they come and they found that, wow, this is very useful, then they will continue to come even without taking the box. But without the tick the box element, nobody will come up. That's the dilemma. How much ticking the box do we need?
Can I come in? Hong Kong has been a little bit slow, apparently, reluctant to invest too much in professional development for university teachers. In a lot of places in Europe, the box ticking is at a whole nother level. In Sweden, for example, where I recently moved from, every university teacher has to take the equivalent of 2 semester-long courses in how to be a university teacher. And since that's a requirement, now PhD students typically are all but required to do it as part of their training. But those of us who join the game a little bit later have to do it. Now, I mean, you're right. I teach on a lot of these. I come in on a lot of these and do sessions on plagiarism. And there are certainly people there who don't particularly want to be there because it's a required course. But as Eva said, this is perhaps what we have to do, and we can perhaps cultivate an awareness of how important professional training is. How to address plagiarism is part of that. You made a very good point about how this really is a university-wide objective, but where does responsibility for that sit? And I think it's easier, and this isn't all of the solution, but it's easier to make it an objective if we can formulate a positive objective. What is our objective? Avoiding plagiarism? Well, that's just what we don't want to be doing. That's not actually an objective. An objective would be something like, turn the question of plagiarism around. What is it that you do when you're not plagiarizing? In academic writing, you can't avoid referring to other sources. That's not academic writing. We always build on the work of other scholars. So what do you have to be able to do? You have to be able to incorporate the work that other people have done in your own work, and you have to be able to signal the fact that you've done that to the reader transparently. So I think if we had a set of objectives that said, at the end of their education, we hope that all students should be able to write from sources and signal their source use transparently. It would be a lot easier to assign collective responsibility for that than when we only formulate a negative objective. We don't want plagiarism to happen. That makes it the exception to stomp out when we see it, rather than something we're actively working for as a matter of practice.
Any other questions? Any question you would like to ask? Oh, you're the best student.
I have loads of questions, the whole sheet of questions, and probably to our two experts here. Now we understand we can easily trace plagiarism in English because we can put it into technology like Turnitin. Okay, but how do we? First of all, it's like, what happens if students, look at a piece of Chinese writing, right, in Chinese paper or something like that, right, in some Chinese journal, right, in Chinese, and then they got the idea from it, and then they paraphrase it, right, and and then write it back into English. Number one is, how do we know? Probably not. Number two is, right, and is that the borderline, or are we at the cross line? How? Yes. I know the other way is harder, right? English to Chinese is probably harder because, there's more people know about the English. Yeah. Sorry.
Good question.
We're having an argument about who answers it, because neither of us want to. I don't know. I've never thought about that. Do you know, the devil in me, when you were explaining that, I thought, well, isn't that clever? Good on them. Then I thought, that's not very ethical. So I don't want to say too much more because I want to sum up at the end. But yeah, that's a really good problem and another grey area, isn't it? Yeah. Diane?
Yeah, I'll just come in briefly. I think for the kinds of assessments I give, it would never be acceptable for a student to find someone else's answer and translate. But I think it probably depends on the kind of assessments you're giving. So once again, let's not get the cart before the horse. Maybe a more relevant question here is not, is that plagiarism, but is it okay? If the purpose of the assessment is simply to require students to retrieve a body of content, then possibly that's acceptable. If the nature of the assessment is to require them to set a bit of content in relationship to another, to demonstrate that they can analyze or reason around a body of content, then translating somebody else's reasoning doesn't demonstrate mastery of that learning objective. So if we kind of think again, not just about plagiarism is difficult to define, but we know that, however, we know it's a dreadful thing. How do we know what things to put in the box? If we look a little bit more broadly at how students and the way they write on assessment tasks demonstrate mastery of the intended learning objectives, then the question of whether this is plagiarism or not becomes less relevant.
No, I'm more thinking of, instead of just assessment level, I'm more thinking of the, say, final year project or, postgraduate project level, where I'm sure that in China and many other countries, right, with different languages, they would have loads of very brilliant minds, but they're not published publicly, right? So I could go into maybe Tsinghua University and go into the library, look at one of the theses and go, brilliant, I'm going to go back and write it up in English, right? And how do we avoid that? How do we even, I know it's wrong, right? But this is a brilliant, it could even give me commercial patents or whatever, which they're not doing, right? Say, for example. So how do we, there's no gray line on that one.
I don't have a solution, but I want to add difficulty to that question because so far we're only talking about writing, right? But what happens, because now in our discipline, particularly, I think you're liberal arts, we're liberal arts, in our discipline, we actually, when we want to move into arts, it's not just the written arts, it's actually the creative arts, media arts, all sorts of things. Now, in the creative industry, I don't know about you, I sing all sorts of songs, anytime, anywhere. So is that plagiarism? I didn't get permission from them to use. And if I actually translate an English song to Chinese or Chinese songs to English, do it all the time. Is that plagiarism, or is that a creative use of the material to extend its boundaries? So somehow, even with writing alone, it's difficult. So what happens when you start talking to students in a different discipline that they have to create an art object? So they saw something from, they visit the Slade School of Arts and actually visit the museum in the UK and come back and do something similar. Are they copying, or are they amalgamating the ideas and bringing it into art? Once we actually go into the international scene, it really is difficult. And Turn It In doesn't even start to address it.
And just briefly, that was the other part of your question of how do we catch it? And you're right, Turn It In isn't a very good tool for catching that sort of thing, but also Turn It In isn't a very good tool for catching most sorts of things, except but percentages of what? It is a very, very unreliable tool. So this is.
Anything else?
Yeah, any recommendation from you?
There is no reliable way to detect plagiarism. So any regimen for combating plagiarism that relies on detection is failed at the outset, and so that's why I think pedagogy is our most important tool. Now, this is a counsel of perfection, and the way you do this depends so much on the nature of the assessment, the level, the discipline, and so on. But you were talking about a final year project as an example. I suppose in a final year project, the student or the group of students, they're working with a supervisor, they're coming in, they're touching base from time to time. That means that the supervisor has had an opportunity to see ideas grow across the semester. In the case of an academic writing course, we often ask our students to do drafts, and they get feedback, and if they have produced the first draft themselves, they're able to make significant changes to it. If they can't, it might suggest that they actually aren't the ones who architected the first draft in the first place. If they come in with a perfect second draft where the first one was unreadable, that raises all kinds of questions. So there are approaches, there are lots and lots of pedagogical approaches that will flag up plagiarism, not with 100% reliability, but with much more reliability than turn it in. And here's the problem: they all take time, right? And we're all under pressure to, all under various kinds of time pressure. And unfortunately, engaging with this very important issue, there just aren't shortcuts.
Panel, do you have question for other panel members? Otherwise, I'll let Marcia to make a conclusion. Okay, thank you.
The conclusion, I think they're done. Okay. So that was just absolutely fascinating. What a wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much. I used to have the same colour hair as Eugenia. That's my natural colour. And in my 20s, it started going grey. And just a few months ago, I started to let it go grey. So that's my natural colour. So I'm very interested in grey areas. So Cecilia and Paul, Cecilia talked about the grey line. Paul talked about the grey area. I really like that. And I think with grey areas, apart from hair, just let it go is my advice. With grey areas, policy can help, and Paul talked about that. But I think you have to go to principles. And here's my thoughts to wind up what everyone said on the grey area of plagiarism. Here are 5 principles. The first is that an ethical approach is always better than an unethical approach. So Celia mentioned the ethics. So I don't have the answers here, just the principles that maybe will help guide your thinking. The second is that we should focus on the student. And we all know that, and that's why we're in the room. But we might have to help some of our colleagues, particularly senior colleagues, and I can say that as a senior person in a university. We need people like you to talk to us because we have no idea what's going on. And we're just looking at budget spreadsheets all day and worrying about student numbers and dollars. Really, that's often a day's work. So come and talk to us politely and carefully and all that, because you don't interrupt where we're up to in the spreadsheet. So that's the second one, that we should focus on the student. The third principle, and that's what I've talked about today, is that the educative approach is better than a punitive one as the primary focus. Of course, punishment has its place as a deterrent. And so in that, a number of things were raised by my colleagues and by you in the audience. Compulsory training. So I didn't talk about compulsory, I was tempted to, but compulsory training of students. It's not ethical, as Celia said, to punish someone for something that you haven't made sure that they understood what not to do. And for staff, as Paul and others have raised, compulsory training for staff. It is fascinating to me as I go around the world, and I'm in my 27th or 28th year in higher education. It's the only profession that you can do it without any training. Imagine if you'd said to someone who wanted to be a doctor, you've got 2 children who are doctors, I'm really interested in sharing my medical knowledge. I'm just going to be a doctor. I'm just going to start operating on people. But that's actually what we do in higher education. You've got a PhD in something. Sometimes you don't even have a PhD. I started teaching without one. you know a lot about one tiny, tiny area, and you're let loose on hundreds and thousands of students. It's shocking. So, let's help the teachers. That's a very important part of it. So compulsory training. I love the second chances that Paul talked about. That's an educative approach. I used to be a primary school teacher, and when I trained, it was very much about phonics, teaching children that sounds are attached to letters was not allowed. It was all about the holistic approach, just show them books. And I used to shut the door and say, okay, letter B today, b, and teach all the children secretly how to sound out the letters. Now the phonics has come back and it's fashionable again. So second chances, I understand as educators. That's part of an educative approach. I'm not against that. Is this recorded? Oh, too late. Oh, well. Using technology, and Ava talked about that, wherever you can, very helpful. I really like what Diane said, understanding that all teachers are writing teachers. I think the scientists in the room have more trouble with that because it's a very factually based approach. But in fact, there are ways to write about science that are appropriate to science, not appropriate elsewhere. All teachers are writing teachers. I really like that. Yeah. And a multi-level strategy is better than an ad hoc, and Mark talked about that. It's okay to do things for students and teachers, but actually it has to happen across the board. How do you do that? Talk to senior people is my advice. So that's the third principle, that the educative approach. The fourth one of the 5, that having objectives and making them positive, and again Diane said that, is really critical. What do you want students to be able to do? What are the gains you want them to make rather than what do you want to stop them doing? And that's a lovely flip. Thank you for that. That's a gift I'll take away with me. My PhD is actually in positive psychology, but I've never thought about plagiarism that way. So that is learning for me today. Thank you. And the 5th one about this grey area is that, and this is from Paul, discussing and debating and working with the ambiguity of a grey area is better than pretending it's not there. So that's I'm taking away today. Thank you. So I just thought that was wonderful, and what a great discussion. Thank you, everyone. And back to you, Eugenia.
Actually, I didn't talk about Lingnan. Actually, our students also have to do an online plagiarism course, and then there were a lot of the words from the student. It really took them a lot of time. So what they did is really a tick. All right. So if they said they have done it, then we just assume they have. All right. And the new colleagues also, we have a seminar by a colleague called Mark Hampton that you're going to meet later. To Mark, okay, and he will talk about plagiarism and how unreliable Turnitin is. All right. So for our staff as well as for the RPG student. She's our research student. Yeah, Marcia, I didn't tell you. Actually, we also open it up to our research student because we think it's very important. They will be teachers. Yeah. So for the undergrad, I'm not sure if they learn anything in particular except the online plagiarism course. Maybe the teacher can tell me. But of course, I know also the English Center also and the library also taught them something about plagiarism. And also we have some guidebook for the educators about plagiarism. You can see I was very busy. Actually, it's not my private work. I asked my colleague, do we have spare copies? Okay, so if there's no more question, just before we go for lunch, we would like to present some souvenirs to the panel members, well, for our guest speaker. Thank you. Thank you.
Make sure we're the same height in the photo.
Okay, I'm shorter. Thank you, Diana. Not Diana, sorry, Marcia.
I'll just come over because it's a good place to take pictures.
Yes, it's better.
Again, it's actually difficult standing next to
A tall person.
She's my good friend, Eva. Thank you. This is thank you very much. This is our 50 years of anniversary book.
nice souvenir.
I have a nice light.
Yes, for you.
You've got one with the case.
This in Chinese. Yeah. Just one in English. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think it's actually in both English and
Chinese
Chinese.
one. What's that? Yeah, that's English, isn't it? Thank you.
Both English and Chinese.